Hello, welcome to another edition, the third, of On the Money. I'm George Smith, and I'm glad to have you here. Before we begin, I want to mention that once again, we're going to talk about Ben Bernanke and his visit to George Washington University on March the 20th of this year, 2012. And if it seems like I'm picking on Dr. Bernanke, I am. I think his lecture deserves a lot of picking on. In talking about the gold standard, Mr. Bernanke talks about when it began, when it ended, what its definition is, and one interesting characteristic. He said a gold standard is more or less an automatic monetary system. Let's listen.
In the period after the Civil War, until World War I, and then really all the way into the 30s, the United States was on a gold standard. And as you probably know, a gold standard is at least a partial alternative to a central bank. There were central banks that helped manage the gold standard, but to a significant extent, a true gold standard creates an automatic monetary system.
On this last point, he's correct. A gold standard is an automatic monetary system. But I wonder if he really understands what that means. To me, it means he'd be out of a job if we had a true gold standard. And what would that mean if he was out of a job? Well, for one thing, he'd have to go back to teaching college, but maybe he couldn't teach college. Maybe he'd have nothing to teach. Consider, thanks largely to Ron Paul, and I'm reading here from my article, the Fed is suffering by far the worst criticism in its history, which was the main reason Bernanke was holding class at GWU. If the Fed is abolished, it will put a huge blot on the resumes of FOMAC members. That's members of the Federal Open Market Committee. It's one thing to lose one's job because of shifting demand among consumers, but quite another to lose it because your policies caused major economic crises and helped put millions of those consumers out of work. Mr. Bernanke talks about how the gold standard of the 19th century caused crises, panics, and it extended into the 20th century a little bit as well. Until finally the Federal Reserve was created and eventually gold was abandoned and we used something else for money. Well, that something else we used, we really didn't have much choice about. The government forced it on us. But think about that for a second. The implication is that gold somehow was inadequate as a money, even though it served mankind for 2,000 years, who knows. But so all of a sudden in the 19th, 20th century, it started to act up and we had to ditch it. Ditch it for what? For paper. This. Well, and to me, that's like removing money from the monetary system to get it to work. Why on earth would we do something like that? Well, because Bernanke said we need to have a lender of last resort, which would be the central bank, the Federal Reserve. And certainly the lender of last resort can't lend gold. It can't just create gold out of midair. So it has to deal with paper, or digits, the equivalent of paper. And that's what we have today. We know that money created from nothing allows the user of that money to get something for nothing. Paper money, therefore, acquires a new trait. No longer is it just a medium of exchange, it becomes a medium for wealth transfer. Since the transfer lacks transparency for most people, it becomes the ultimate political tool. He has some criticisms of the gold standard as it pertains to its ability to protect or guard wealth. It's often thought that it's at least stable in value and doesn't inflate much and so forth. But he thinks he's found some problems with it. Let's listen to him.
And finally, just one last word on the gold standard. One of the strengths that people cite for the gold standard is that it creates a stable value for the currency, creates stable inflation. And that's true over very long periods. But over shorter periods, maybe up to 5 or 10 years, you can actually have a lot of inflation, rising prices, or deflation, falling prices in a gold standard. And the reason is that in a gold standard, the amount of money in the economy varies according to things like gold strikes. So, for example, if in the United States, if gold is discovered in California and the amount of gold in the economy goes up, that will cause an inflation. Whereas if the economy is growing faster and there's a shortage of gold, that will cause a deflation. So
The one thing that seems to elude him about a gold standard is that the production of gold on the market is influenced by market forces, profit and loss. So if there's profit to be made in mining and minting gold, certainly that will happen. But when that profit ceases, it won't happen. And because of market mechanisms, the gold standard would not allow a perpetual overissuance of money. And that phrase came from a speech by Alan Greenspan, in which he pointed out all the inflation that we had following the abandonment of the gold standard. Also, Mr. Bernanke is fearful, almost paranoid about a possibility of deflation. And although you can define deflation in several ways, one way is to say it's a drop in price. That's not how Austrians would define it, but it's how it's most commonly used. Well, what in the world's wrong with a drop in price, a drop in all prices? We know that price deflation results when we have the production of non-monetary goods exceeding the production of money, or when the demand to hold money increases. This does not necessarily, not only is it not an economic evil, it's actually a good thing most of the time. Let me quote from an article by Jeffrey Herbener, an economist, who recently had an article published on Mises.org. It's about his testimony before Congress. He said that two of the periods of most rapid economic growth in U.S. history were from 1820 to 1850 and 1865 to 1900. In each of these periods, the purchasing power of the dollar roughly doubled, which is another way of saying that prices dropped. Declining prices is a norm for a free market economy. It encourages people to save, which builds up the economy's capital structure, but it also encourages consumption because goods get cheaper. The electronics industry today is probably the best example of how falling prices allow more and more people to enjoy the market's bounty. I suppose you could conclude that deflation is okay sometimes, but certainly not in the case of the Great Depression, because we saw prices really plunge then, and the Depression was long and terrible until the gold standard was abandoned and the Fed could start to print some money and increase the money supply, and things started to recover a little bit. So yeah, deflation seemed to be very closely associated with depression, at least in that case. Well, a couple of researchers in 2004, an economics professor at UCLA and an economist with the Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis, looked at 17 countries trying to find empirical links between deflation and depression. They looked at that for a period of 100 years. And what they found was that the data show virtually no link between deflation and depression. Well, that's all very well and good, but what about the Great Depression? I mean, was that exactly what happened? Well, Robert Murphy points out that if deflation, asking a question here, if deflation is really so harmful, how do we explain U.S. prosperity of the period 1926 to 1928? Remember that, the Roaring '20s? During those 3 years, consumer prices fell 2.1, 1.1, and 1.2% respectively from 1926 to 1928. Well, of course, you can come back and say, oh my gosh, well, the deflation of the 1930s was much worse than that. But let me quote something from Murphy's book here. From their peak in June 1920, prices fell 15.8% over the next 12 months. A one-year deflation that was 50% more severe than any 12-month fall during the Great Depression. And yet the 1920-1921 depression was so short-lived that most Americans today are unaware of its existence. Does that close the case on deflation? Looks pretty bad. In the classroom video, Bernanke talks about the movie It's a Wonderful Life starring Jimmy Stewart. You may recall that. Jimmy Stewart is the owner of a bank, a small bank, and during the Great Depression, and one day he finds the lobby full of depositors clamoring for their money. And Jimmy Stewart doesn't quite have enough. He doesn't have nearly enough. So Bernanke says, goodness, if only Jimmy had access to a central bank, they could have loaned him the money. Well, a couple of things we can point out here. One is the central bank doesn't have gold. If it has gold, it's not going to just throw gold around. It doesn't have any more gold than anyone else. So what the bank would loan Jimmy Stewart or any other bank would be bills, paper bills. Secondly, Bernanke says that the bank, and any bank for that matter, that has adequate collateral would qualify for a loan from a central bank, from the Federal Reserve at least. And he says the bank in question in the movie was illiquid and not insolvent. Well, consider that for a second. The deposits the bank held were liabilities due on demand. An institution is solvent if it is able to pay all debt obligations as they become due. Well, clearly, they were becoming due right then, since they were on demand, and they couldn't meet it. Jimmy Stewart's bank could not meet those obligations, therefore it was insolvent. Having a central bank step in and throwing money its way just simply creates a moral hazard, and it's a way of keeping insolvent banks operating while postponing the calamity that results from fractional reserve banking. And that is the main point, I guess you could say, of my article and of this video. It's not the gold standard that causes the problem, it's fractional reserve banking. The central bank was a solution to fractional reserve banking to the extent that it keeps creating these moral hazards by coming to the rescue of banks that get in trouble by loaning them money, or what we might call bailouts if the banks are big enough and the amount loaned or given away is large enough. But it's not the gold standard that failed. The gold standard functions just fine if government and the bankers, the big bankers, let it alone. It's fractional reserve banking, and it's still going on today. It's going to go on until it drives us out of business or until we stop it. Well, that's it for now. I hope you'll read the article. Again, it's called Ben Bernanke Goes Back to School. Ben Bernanke Goes Back to School. I hope you'll read it, and thank you for watching. I hope if you like this video, I hope you'll indicate it by checking like and sharing it, if you will. Thanks a lot, and have a great day.